Hello beautiful artist, thank you for joining me for this sunflower tutorial today. Sunflowers are one of my favorite flowers. Their bright colors can't help but make you feel a little bit brighter yourself. And so today we are going to capture that brightness primarily with a medium yellow, along with a yellow ochre, a cadmium orange, and a burnt umber for the shadows. I've also put out a sap green, which I'll mix with a little bit of that burnt umber to create the stem of the flower. I've drawn a faint circle here and a bit of a stem just as a rough guide for where I'm going to place things for my painting. I'm going to start off with this slightly tapered brush that'll help us get the shape of the sunflower petals, and I'm also going to use this thin 00 for some details a bit later. There are a few different ways you can go about this, but I'm going to start by painting all of the yellow petals of the flower and then coming in to do the center later because the center is a darker color. So if we paint all the petals inwards and overlap this centerpiece, it won't be as noticeable because we can just paint over it with our dark colors later. So I'm going to start with my medium yellow. And just painting in some of those initial petals. We're going to use a bit of a wet on wet technique in the beginning here to add some depth to the petals, and then we'll come back in later with a wet on dry technique to add some more details and shadows. To get the shape of my petal, I'm going to put the tip of the paintbrush down, apply pressure to flatten it out, and then gently release at the bottom to get that tapered effect. I'm going to leave a gap in between the petals for now, and then when they start to dry, I'll come back in and fill them in so we get a little bit of an overlap without all the paint just running together. While the petals are still wet, you can come back in and dot in a little bit more yellow. Next, I'm going to add a bit of yellow ochre into the mix with a wet on wet technique. I'm just going to dab a little bit of the yellow ochre into the tips of the petals and just naturally let the water spread it around. You don't have to do this with all the petals. You can add it up the side with some. I'm gonna clean my brush again, and I might just drop a bit more water back into some of those petals. While it's still wet, you can move it around as much as you like. Add colour, add water. Change the shape of your petals if you're not happy with them. Next, I'll add a little bit of orange to some of the petals. Same technique as our yellow ochre. I'm just going to dab a little bit of orange into the mix and let the water take some of the control with how it turns out. If you find any of your petals are getting too dark or the colour is run where you don't want it to go, you can use a clean semi-dry brush to soak up some of that water and take some of that colour away. I'll let the petals start to dry a bit now before I do any more. If you want, you can get your hairdryer out to speed things along a little bit. I don't want it to be completely dry, but I'd like to just have a bit more control as we add our next colours. While these flowers are just a little bit damp still, we can come in with a bit more control on those shadows. You'll notice when you lift the paintbrush, that's where the colour tends to pool. So I like to sometimes paint in to out of where I want. So the colour pools at the tip of this petal rather than in the centre of it. Gonna come back in with a few more of those water droplets. Just dabbing them on different petals. Reactivate some of those watercolour blooms. Now I'm gonna use a clean, semi-dry brush add some light back into some of these petals by taking away some of the water and pigment. Now it's time to allow it to dry completely. We are back with some nice dry petals. Now I'm basically just going to repeat the same process, but come in and overlap our new petals in all the gaps we left. And just as before, we're gonna jump in with some orange, with some yellow ochre, with some water, whatever you feel you want to add to your petals. Give it a little bit of depth, some value in the lights and darks, keeping the dark colors on the insides of our petals and letting them blend to light as they get to the edge. I am originally a videographer by trade, and a few years ago I got to film a music video in a sunflower field. And that was an extremely fun project, and the colors of the sunflowers as the sun got low in the sky towards the sunset, absolutely beautiful footage we got from that shoot. And as you may know, if you've watched any of my other tutorials, I live in Queensland in Australia, currently on the Sunshine Coast, which is not too far from a place called Umber in the Darling Downs region, where there are some beautiful sunflower fields that I have taken many a photo of over the years. While we wait for this layer to dry, we can start working on the stem of our flower. So I'm going to mix a little bit of Sap Green with some burnt sienna to get a bit more of an earthy, muted colour for our stem. And I'm going to be pretty loose when I paint the stem and the leaves. I've drawn a bit of a guideline here to start with for the stem. And while that is still quite wet, I'm going to just tap a little bit of brown into there, a little bit more green, to create a bit of interest. I'll come and tidy up the top of the stem around our petals when they're completely dry. And again, just very loose, not thinking about it too much. I'm gonna come in and paint the shape of our leaves coming off the stem. I'll just grab my 00 brush here to come tidy up the top of this stem, making sure our petals are quite dry so no colour leaks in. I can also use my small brush with a little bit of the burnt umber to come and add a few little details. And again, gonna leave it to dry, then we'll come back and finish off the center of our flower. Now for the center of this flower, I'm gonna start by putting some water in the middle here. Not going over our petals just yet. I'm going to start by adding some of that burnt umber. And just letting it flow around as watercolor does. Now I'll paint my brown out towards my petals. We'll come back in with our small brush soon and fix up those details. Put a few little water splotches in there. Just let the paint move around on its own. Now I'll pick up my small brush. I'm gonna keep the paint quite thick so it's nice and dark when we come in and fill in some of these gaps. And sunflowers often have a second ring in the center. So with that, while the paint is still really wet, so it just blends out naturally, I'm gonna dab darker amount of brown to create that center ring there. And for the moment, I'm just gonna put my brush down and leave it to dry. After letting it dry a little bit, I'm gonna come back in with a bit more brown and just touch in some of these little outer details here. Okay, for some finishing touches, I'm going to get a bit of the yellow ochre, a bit of the orange, and just mix them together to get a deeper, warmer yellow. Using my 00 brush, I'm going to paint a few details on our petals. I won't do this on every petal, I'll just choose a few to help create some separation between our two layers. I'll also fill in some of those white gaps with this deeper orange to make it look like there's more petals behind. Finally, I'm going to add a few paint splatters of green and yellow, and then this piece will be complete. Thank you for joining me for this tutorial today. I hope you enjoyed painting with me. As always, it was a pleasure to have you along. If you haven't already, I would really appreciate you giving this video a like and subscribe for more easy watercolor tutorials. I can't wait to see you again next time. Until then, just keep painting.